Hey everybody, this is Peter Svidler with the recap video for round 4 of the Berlin candidates. It has been a long day and it shows no signs of becoming any shorter, but this game just needs to be covered. And these are weird words for me to say because we were kind of downplaying it from the very beginning during the live broadcast with Jan. How wrong we were. And This is probably going to be a long video, so I'll stop with the preview and jump right into the game. And there we go, recentralize, or at least somewhat recentralize. The game we're looking at today is the game between Vladimir Kramnik and Kramnik-Caruana. Two people who were doing extremely well in the tournament already. Well, extremely well is maybe strong, but Vladimir definitely was doing very, very well. He was on 2.5 out of 3 before the game started. Sole leader of the tournament, playing confidently, just won a brilliant game against Levon Aronian in the previous round. Losing my voice there a little bit. This might become a problem later on in the video, but we'll persevere. And obviously a very important game in the context of the tournament. His opponent on +1, one of his direct competitors for the top spots. Obviously it's a very long tournament, but after 4 rounds you can already start noticing some trends and trying to judge who does well and who does less well. And Vladimir Kramnik in this tournament has shown a number of opening approaches. He started the tournament off by winning a game against Alexander Grishuk where he went 1d4 and then went for something quiet and unassuming. In round 2 he played 1e4 and against Sergei Karyakin they played a very, very mainline Berlin and that ended in a draw. And against Fabiano, who knows what he was playing against the Spanish, because Fabiano these days plays the Petrov regularly, and this is what he went for today. Knight e5 d6, knight f3 knight e4. And this story we told during the live broadcast, but it kind of bears repeating. With maybe 10 minutes before the start of the broadcast, Jan was doing something in XSplit, and I was basically looking at my phone as usual. But I also had one eye on the main screen, and on the main screen there was a starting position with, as is normal for Chess24, Stockfish 8 running in the background. And Stockfish 8 was suggesting that this position is best play by both sides, followed up by Queen e2, Queen e7, and Knight c3. And I just started kind of giggling and showed this to Jan and said, chess is completely doomed if machines are now suggesting this is best play. Obviously not at great depth, but at any depth, to my eyes, this seemed like anything but best play for white. An extremely unambitious, at first glance, attempt to deal with the Petrov. And we had that short conversation with Jan and then proceeded to start covering the tournament, and there were some exciting openings on other boards. And then I happened to glance at the Kramnik-Caruana game, and there it was, this position on the board, for no reason that I could see. And we stopped talking about whatever it was that we were talking at the time and kind of discussed this briefly and said, yeah, this is probably not going to be a particularly exciting game. We were wrong so many times during the live broadcast today about the direction this game is going to take. Knight takes e3, obviously there is no reason for black to avoid this, although I don't think knight f6 loses necessarily, but I mean, not taking on c3 just feels completely wrong. G takes c3, queen e2, takes knight c6, bishop e3, bishop e7, castles long, castles short. And yeah, we do get opposite color castling, but in general, with the queens off, going for some kind of a pawn storm on the king side is not going to yield too many dividends. Although this is exactly what, in a very, very recent game, a promising Russian player, Vladislav Artemiev, did against Alexander Khalifman. He played rook hg1, a6, g4, rook e8, h4. He was eventually somewhat worse, but I think somewhere along the way machines were claiming he had a little bit of an advantage. So this plan does exist. But Kramnik, who of course was aware of that game, decided not to repeat all this and played rook h e1, which seems like a very conservative approach. Bishop f6. And the normal move in this position, I suspect, is something like knight d4, to which black can reply by taking on d4, which is fine, or playing bishop d7 first and taking at a later date, which is also fine. And this is sort of the expected course of action here. This is what I would have thought would happen in the game. And Kramnik had other ideas. He played knight d2. It's also worth noting that as a kind of a joke, you can go rook e1, g1 back here. And compared to rook h g1 played by Artemiev in his game, this might actually win you a tempo, because if you play g4 and then g5 later in the game, it will drive the bishop back. But and it will also draw obvious parallels with the rook g8 may move that Vladimir played against Levon Aronin in the previous round, but not what he did. He went knight g2, rook e8 is a very logical move to stop knight e4, bishop f3. And here, once again, black can, I think, deal with the idea of knight e4 in a number of fashions. You can just completely ignore it and play bishop e6, for instance. Knight e4, just go back to e7. I don't think black faces really any kind of serious problems, although knight g5 could become a bit awkward, so I'm not sure about the wisdom of playing bishop e6. But the most direct approach is what Fabiano chose here. After bishop f3, he played knight e5, the move that you kind of begs to be played. The bishop on f3 is under attack. If it goes somewhere immediately, black has the option of playing knight g4 here, or preparing it by playing c6 first, or playing king f8, which is generally useful in these types of positions. There's a great number of options available to black. Vladimir started by bishop f4, opening the e-file and not committing to any position of the f3 bishop yet. King f8 is the most obvious reply, re-establishing the threat of knight takes e3 by protecting the rook on e8. And here, a conservative move would be something like bishop e4. We even discussed this during the show. Something like rook b8 can be played in reply to prepare bishop d7, protecting the b7 pawn. And you can actually even take on h7 after g6, bishop h6, bishop g7. During the live show, we discussed the fact that doing this loses to bishop g4. But instead of bishop takes g7, the bishop can just return to f4. And it appears as if there is nothing really better for black here than playing bishop f6 and allowing this repetition. Because there's really no other effective way of going after the h7 bishop. This is not really very relevant. And the game is long enough that I probably should stop going off on these tangents. There will be enough material to cover anyway. Vladimir played bishop d5 instead, c6, and bishop b3. And I guess he expected Fabi to play d5 here. And then after c4, takes, and knight takes c4. This probably is very close to complete equality, but white obviously never risks anything. And if anyone has a slight pull here after takes, and bishop takes c4, it is of course white, because the king on e8 is somewhat misplaced for the time being. Although after bishop f5, I don't think black really is worse at all. But Fabi played bishop f5 first, and at this point you can begin seeing the outlines of how black can become better. I don't think black is better yet, not at all, but you can start seeing how he can become better, because this bishop on b3 is really not that smart. And if you can somehow make sure that it never really comes out and continues standing there doing not very much, you can definitely start preferring the black position. So white should perhaps pay attention. Vladimir played h3, creating squares for the f4 bishop, and also once and for all solving any potential issues he might have with knight g4 later in the game. Fabi also gained some space on the king side by playing g5 and king g7. And here I think Vladimir's choice can be criticized. I think the move he made is ill-judged. He didn't like the point that after knight e4, black can take and play d5 and maybe even follow it up by b5, completely locking down this bishop on b3. So he made the move c4. I think he thought that this will ensure he will play knight e4 safely next move. and have a stable little advantage. But that misjudged Black's reply quite badly, and this, I think, is the source of all the objective problems White has had later in the game. Instead of that, something like f4, I think, was called for. And the position after takes and something like h5, I think, is a position of probably dynamic equality. But White can always sort of bail out by playing knight c4 and forcing a number of exchanges, and also taking the bishop, which is currently on b3 and not doing very much out of its corner, because Black needs to take and allow it to return to normal squares. After c4, Fabi played a very strong move, g5, g4, which actually gives Black a reasonably serious pull, creating immediate counterplay against the White king side, which is not that easy to parry. Knight e4 looks very, very logical, because if you take on g4, knight takes g4, and play bishop g3, for instance, bishop e5 is quite decent, but even stronger is the move bishop g5, which leaves White very, very tied up and feeling kind of miserable about life. The position is not maybe horrible as such, but it's quite clear that something has gone badly wrong, and Black is the active side playing for a win here. Vladimir played knight e4, which is very natural, but after taking on e4 and playing bishop g5 check, I think by this point you can safely assume that Black is in control of what's happening on the board, and White needs to be very, very careful not to run into serious difficulties here. Bishop f4 is just completely impossible because of knight g6, so White has to go king b1, gh3. It's important to include gh3 immediately, because if you start with f5, rook d4 and gh3, now White can play f4. And the fact that there is nobody on the e-file makes it a lot easier for White to survive these types of complications. You will see why in a moment. So Fabi starts with this. If you go f4 here, knight g4 is more or less completely winning, because here White needs to swap on e8, giving up the only open file. Fg knight h2, gh knight f3. This is close to, or maybe just completely mathematically lost. I wouldn't be surprised if this position was already past the recovery point for White. But of course it was possible to recapture on h3 here, which is something Kramnik decided not to do after some lengthy thought. But I guess by this point he realized that his position after f5 is just horribly unpleasant. The choices are really not that pretty here. If you go rook e1, Black goes knight f3, takes, and bishop takes d6 is forced, knight d2 check, king a1. And in this position Black is comfortable after many moves. But if he finds knight e4, which is really not that difficult to find, you hit the bishop on d6, White still has no luft on the queen side, so this actually is a piece that is hanging. And also the pawn on f2 is hanging. And if you go bishop b2, protecting the e1 square, so that you have, after knight takes f2, the rook d7, rook takes b7 resource, you're actually still in a ton of trouble after c5, because once again, you have to remind yourself that your bishop on b3 is half dead, and the Black initiative on the king side is a lot more relevant to the evaluation of this position than the fact that you won some pawns on the queen side. This is really an unpleasant position for White. And the other option after f5 would be to take on e5, to which Black takes with a pawn, rook d7, let's say we go king f6, rook e1, and here Black is not at all obliged to defend this pawn on b7. You play e4, and if you take on b7, rook a d8 probably is interesting here as well, although maybe it's a little bit too ambitious, but you can start with bishop h4 first and only play rook a d8 after rook f1. And this position, after thinking for a bit, the computer starts disliking quite intensely, because the threat of bishop takes f2 immediately if White does nothing, or let's say White makes a luft for the king and then Black goes rook d2. Nobody really cares about how many pawns get lost on the 7th rank, because these two will just queen if the pawn on f2 falls. So this is kind of horrible for White. And you can understand, in particular, if you think about the fact that in this position Fabi had maybe 3 minutes left for the remaining 18 moves, having spent a ton of time previously on a number of decisions. You can understand why Vladimir chose to play c5, which at least has the advantage of sharpening up the game a tremendous amount. But objectively, black is probably close to winning here. f5 was played by Fabi, a correct move and a very strong one. You need to control the g4 square, because if you play h takes g, white takes cd, and after knight f3, he does have rook g4. Black probably is still doing quite well here, but f5 is just much stronger. So f5 was played, rook b4, hg, rook b7, king h8, c takes d4, and simply knight f3. And the pawn on g2 will, by this point, quite obviously cost white a full piece. White will pick some pawns up on the queen side. Vladi did find the best move in the position, which is bishop a4. But Fabi continued playing extremely well for a while from this moment on. He took on h2, which is correct, bishop takes c6. Rook a d8 is a very strong tactical resource based on the fact that bishop takes e8 immediately loses to knight f1. Or rook takes d6 followed by knight f1, but I think this is clean enough. And bishop takes g2 runs obviously into rook takes d6, destroying the one important trump that white had in this position, and this is more or less resignable. Vladi played d7, rook e2, bishop g2, rook f2. Yes, white currently has a passed pawn on d7 and a number of other pawns on the queen side, but they don't look really very threatening right now. And by this point we were yet another turning point in the game where we were quite certain of a result. And you can make an argument we weren't much wrong, but there were still twists in the road. We were saying that this is completely winning for Fabi, and regardless of the fact how much time he has left, he will convert this into a full point. Bishop c6. Knight f1 is probably the best move in this position from black, but it doesn't really matter. Knight g4 is clean enough. Rook takes a7, knight e3, rook g1. And I would like to know exactly how much time Fabi had in this position, because this was a position in which basically one last clean calculation would have finished the game on the spot. Black can play rook takes c2 here. Rook g5, rook c6 is obviously completely lost. White is just down a lot of material with no real compensation. The pawn on d7 will fall. The move that I guess worried Fabi was bishop a4, and if you play rook g2 here, the game does become somewhat unclear, because the a-pawn runs, and black probably is faster here, but you can see why you wouldn't want this with black. It looks messy. It looks like you're allowing an additional amount of complications. But what you need to realize after bishop a4 is that the bishop on g5 is not really hanging if you choose some kind of a reasonable square along the second rank. And something like rook f2 just wins on the spot here, because you want to play bishop f6, creating a ton of pressure against the b-pawn and making sure that white never really gets any kind of counterplay going, because he will be too busy protecting against those very direct threats. And obviously rook takes g5 leads to mate in two moves. So I think rook takes c2 would have ended the game pretty much by the first time control, if not earlier. But instead of that, Fabi played h6, which really isn't even the second best move. Bishop f6 was stronger than that, with a significant advantage for black anyway. But h6 is really neither here nor there. It doesn't really achieve very much. And it also allows rook c7. And this is the point where the game became unclear once again. Rook c8 followed by rook takes g5 is now a very serious counterplay idea for white, which is why the king needs to get closer to the rook. King g7 is correct. White plays a4, king f7. Once again, rook takes c2 was possible here. Rook c8 can be met by rook takes c6, rook takes d8, and rook d6. And after rook e8, it's important to note that despite both of black's light pieces hanging, you can go knight g4, unpinning the bishop on g5. And white needs to make a precise move rook f1 to make an immediate draw, probably, because if you trade g7 for f5, I think white will always have enough counterplay with the a-pawn. And if you try to hang on to the f5 pawn, white always has this mechanism of rook g8 check, and then the rook just goes back. But in extreme time trouble, Fabi made two very, very natural moves, which you kind of make by hand in this position. King f7, bishop b5, And once again, you probably should start pushing your own trumps on the queen side, on the king side here, and play 4. But Fabi made one more stabilizing quote-unquote move, king e7, and now after a5, it really is no longer obvious who is better. The position becomes incredibly messy, and definitely all 3 results are possible. Rook d2, a move I thought was quite good, just doesn't work after a6. It's just too slow. a6, rook, rook d4 is completely pointless, but rook d5 is a move. But after c4, it turns out that you're never really in time to return this material on the queen side, and this is not fast enough. Rook f4 is a good move by Fabi. c3, stopping the rook from coming to b4, is also a correct reply. And here the machine suggests that the move Fabi did make, but on the next move, is strong immediately. He should have gone rook g4 here. And if rook h1, bishop f4, driving the rook away from good squares, seems to be a decent idea here. And this is stronger than what Fabi did at the very least, although white already is doing quite well even here after rook b7, followed by the rather obvious plan of pushing the a-pawn down the board. Fabi played king d6. Here, once again, with the help of engines, and I think tactical ideas like this are extremely difficult to find, in particular in mutual time trouble. Rook c6 check is extremely strong, close to winning, because king d7, rook h6 loses on the spot. And if you go king e7, white apparently can go a6. The only real move here is rook takes d7. And now you go rook c8. Once again, the only move you can ever make in this position is rook a7. And now simply rook e8 and rook takes e3. And I think you're expected to convert your advantage from this moment onwards. Black can try something like rook b4 to at least make white double the pawns on the queen side. But the feeling has to be here that after something like rook h1, there's just too many pawns on the queen side and white wins. Fabi instead was faced with rook b7, which is a much more natural and a much more human move. He replied by rook g4, rook e1 and f4. Finally, at least, black is once again starting to do something on the king side. And this is move 40. So at this point, the players finally had completed the first time control and could catch their breath and reevaluate. And the reevaluation must have been extremely unpleasant for Fabi, because he was more or less completely winning about 10 moves ago, maybe even less than 10 moves ago. I think rook takes c2 is move 32. Yeah, so move 33. 7 moves ago, one final, not really very difficult tactical decision would have pretty much secured the game in his favor. And here we are 7 moves later in a position where white, of course, goes a6. There's no other move. And objectively, he is just winning. There is really nothing black can do to stop the white pawns from getting there. The machine keeps on suggesting that you have to play f3 here. But that is because it thinks that the rook ending, which arises more or less by force after a7, f2, rook e3, bishop e3, rook b8, let's say rook g1 check, king c2, bishop takes a7, rook d8, f1, we take twice, and we go rook a8. And the bishop gets lost. And yeah, and originally the machine just doesn't realize how hopeless this endgame is. And it is completely hopeless. There is absolutely zero chance Kramnik doesn't convert this with his eyes closed. Which is why, after taking a serious amount of time on this decision, Fabi starts pushing the second pawn down the board. This should not objectively save the game, but it is by far the best practical chance, and it does result in more turnarounds. a7 is, of course, the correct move. Rook b8 has to be stopped, so black goes rook a8. And now, for the time being, black sort of stabilizes, because, of course, you don't want to play rook b8 here and give up your wonderful two passers for the piece. Here, black is just completely fine. So it's completely unthinkable to play rook b8. But if you don't play rook b8, you still need to find a plan to break down the black position. And Kramnik thought for a longish while here and came up with what I think is the second best move in the position. It still is objectively a very, very good try, but it's nowhere near as close as we thought, nowhere near as good as we thought originally. Originally, when we were doing commentary on this, we thought that there is the obvious best move in the position, and by obvious I mean obviously the strongest when you have the machine switched on. And then there's a second best move, which is what Kramnik played, but it still wins. But after doing some post-game analysis with the help of engines, we came to realize that no, that actually is a little bit incorrect. It does still win, but it wins in connection with an idea that is extremely easy to miss, that I will show in a moment. It's been such a long day that I almost forgot that this idea existed. And after all this introduction, I should probably start telling you what the moves are. The best move in this position is c3, c4, something Kramnik did not play. And it's connected with a very weird original idea, which I think is extremely possible, and I think you're more or less likely to miss this, because you have this majority on the queen side, and your threat here is basically to play c5 check against almost anything. Let's say h4, c5 check, king takes c5, rook c1, and rook c8, and black resigns. The same happens even if black plays f3, you still play c5 check. And despite the fact that there's now a pawn two squares away from the queening square, the bishop on b5 controls it well enough that you just win all the material on the other side of the board without ever conceding anything on this side. The one move I was kind of wondering how this loses was king c5, but here the machine suggests that simply going b4 check, king takes b4, bishop c6 check, and a very quiet move like bishop f3 here, followed by rook b5 check, bishop takes a8, something like this. Takes, and now bishop to more or less any square. You can put it on b7, you can put it on h1, it doesn't really matter, because this is a full queen. Black cannot even give up a rook for this pawn. And the checks black has after knight c4 are nowhere near enough. The king runs away very, very comfortably with, well, basically any move here. So c4, had Kramnik actually realized this idea exists, would have won in the game quite comfortably. The only way to sort of prolong the game here is to go rook g2, so that after rook c1 check you have rook c2. But this position, I think, should be very, very comfortably winning for white, because black just never gets anywhere near these pawns, and white will neutralize the threat of the two runners on the king side, and then collect all the material he wants on the other side of the board. This is just lost for black. Instead of all this, Vladimir played b4, which is a strong move, but he played it with the wrong idea. After h4, he was still winning here, but he needed to play d8, which is not really a move that, you know, occurs to you very easily. Rook takes d8, rook b8 is a famous motif, so it's not difficult to understand what's happening here. But if black takes with the bishop, this is where the move b4 becomes explained. Black no longer has the king d6, c5 resource, which he had on the previous move, so the king has to go to the e file. And now we go bishop c6, and black is forced to take on a7. And this is a position somewhat similar to what we will see later in the game, but sort of immeasurably better for white compared to what happened in the game. Both of his pawns are alive. The bishop on c6 controls the push of both of black passers, and yes, black of course will continue resisting, because you can imagine him, you know, developing some kind of a push on the king side. So you never resign in this position, but you also pretty much never save it. This has to be objectively winning for white. But instead of this, Vladimir more or less blitzed out c4, h3, c5, king e5. And it remains to, I mean, I haven't seen the press conference, I haven't seen the quotes from the press conference, so I'm not sure if rook b8 was always the plan here from Kramnik, or whether he thought c6 was fast enough, and only here he realized that this position is completely unclear and probably doesn't win for white at all. But something happened, and at this point, all three results pretty much were on again, because best play, in particular, since this was, I think, the 6th hour of the game, best play was an unattainable ideal for both of the players, I think. The best move in this position, objectively, is bishop c6, with the idea of meeting h2 with rook h1. And this appears to be a draw, but it appears to be a draw in a very, very difficult fashion. I don't think it was at all likely that players would have been able to play this game precisely. After rook g1, there are two squares for the white king. King b2 is probably the trickier one, because after king b2, more or less the only way to make a draw here for black is to play f3. Sorry, rook takes h1 is a mistake. You have to play f3, bishop takes f3, and rook g3. Already finding these moves feels like it's extremely unlikely. And the point is, let's say if white pushes the c-pawn, black always has enough counterplay connected with the with knight c4 check, and then giving checks along the third rank. So this holds, and the same applies to bishop c6, knight c4. Let's say king b1, and here black has to play rook a3. And he somehow holds here, but as I already said, finding all this stuff in a practical game would have been pretty much impossible. And if you go king a2, black goes knight c2. Because knight c4 is no longer a check, black cannot play f3, because in the same position, if you don't have knight c4 here, you're just dead lost. White queens everything on the queen side. But black now does have knight c2, creating ideas of knight takes b4, rook takes a7, and so on. Rook h2. And here, knight b2, rook a7 is not very effective, but doing it the other way around actually saves the game. Rook a7, knight b4, king b3, knight takes c6, rook a6. And here there's a number of ways to make a draw for black. The most direct one is to go rook b1 check. And I'll just show you this line as kind of a final weirdness black aims for, and successfully holds this position where he's a full exchange down, because this pawn will get rounded up and won by black. But Vladimir Kramnik reasonably quickly played rook b8, rook a7, rook g8 here, which I managed to spot moments before he played it on the board, and I think my initial reaction was the same as his reaction when he was going for this line. I thought this was just winning on the spot, because you create the threat of rook takes g5 check, and the bishop seemingly, if the bishop has to leave the g5 square because of the horrible threat of rook takes g5, white just wins this rook on g4, because the knight on e3, oh whoops, that was a mistake. Let's do this while I try to get it back. I am not re-recording the entire video. That is not a thing that will happen. So please bear with me. I really don't know what I did to close the file, but close the file I did, and now I need to find it again. Give me a second. Isn't this wonderful? After the day we've had to now, hang on a second. Why isn't this opening? Okay, I'm almost there. This didn't take me as long a time as I feared it might. So where were we? We were here. Oh, almost didn't ruin the video there. It seems like black just loses the rook on g4. And he, in fact, does lose the rook on g4, but there is a source of counterplay which is extremely strong for black here. Fabi played bishop f6 here. And suddenly it turns out that if you just take on g4 here, after king f5, the threat of rook a1 mate is so overwhelming that there is no draw available to white even. After rook e3, fe3, black just goes h2, h1, then rook a1 check and rook takes h1, for instance here. Rook h1, and he just wins. So the move Kramnik played in this position is strictly the only move. He played d8 queen to distract the bishop from f6 for a moment, takes, and rook takes g4. And we come to what to us during the broadcast felt like the final phase of the game. Now that both of white's passers are gone and black has tremendous counterplay against the king on b1, and also two of his passers are reasonably well advanced, we thought, okay, black obviously has enough counterplay, and the game should probably objectively end in a draw. Fabi played bishop f6. It's worth noting that even starting with king f5 here is a draw, because after rook g8, bishop f6, bishop d3 check, you can go king e6, and after king c1 there is a number of moves which draw for black. This king c1 followed by bishop b1 idea will be very relevant later as well. This is an important setup for white to avoid getting in huge trouble on the queen side with his king. But Fabi started with bishop f6. Rook g6, which is what Vladimir played here, is an absolutely only possible reply, because otherwise king f5 would have won. And here you can play king f5, bishop d3 check, king e6, and even this is fine for black. But Fabi went for a different approach. He played rook b7 and won the b4 pawn with check. But it did allow white to put a bishop on a decent square where it controls the advance of the f pawn. And after king a2, Fabi by this point had more time than Vladimir, but this is move 52, only 8 moves to go until the time control. Vladimir had maybe 5 minutes, maybe slightly less than 5 minutes here. And he quite clearly no longer really is playing for a win here, because, I mean, black has 2 pawns to white's 1 pawn. Nobody really cares by this point what the pieces are called. Yes, white has 2 rooks and a bishop against a rook and 2 light pieces, but the amount of pawns you're pushing towards the promotion point is kind of more relevant here. And also black has a much more active king. So objectively this is easily equal for black. And something like bishop e7 with the idea of forcing the pawn to c6 so that this bishop now participates in the game even better, and then starting to give check, would have been an immediate draw. But instead of this, Fabi played knight c2, which I thought was potentially a very serious mistake. Or at least I thought that with the help of engines. Obviously, I couldn't really trust my own evaluation by this point, and neither really could the players, as you will see in a moment. Play did become somewhat randomized at this point. Both players, over the various stages of the game, were playing sharply for a win in a position where maybe this wasn't necessarily justified by objective evaluation. And I think knight c2 was an attempt by Fabi to play for a win in a position which doesn't really carry that attempt that well. And it could have backfired. Knight c2, rook c1 is a correct reply, knight d4. And here, in a situation where he was very seriously short on time, Vladimir did not find the correct move bishop g4, which creates a very, very strong threat of rook e1 check, because the bishop on f6 is going to hang. And objectively, once again, I'll show you what the best play for black here is. Black is supposed to play rook a4 check, king b2, bishop h8 is strictly the only move that doesn't lose this bishop, c6, and you play rook a7 here. And for some reason, probably to do with the fact that after c7 we have those checks along the a and b file, and white cannot really escape to the c file without losing the c7 pawn, this is still probably holdable for black. But in practical terms, I think after bishop g4, white is once again favored to win, because the turnaround would have been very, very difficult to handle, and having to once again switch to defense, allowing the pawn to c6, finding all those only moves to not lose on the spot would have been quite difficult for Fabi. And there's an absolutely fantastical line which seems to hold, which I will now show. But once again, there is about a 0 probability of that being found over the board by anyone. Black actually holds here, I think, if he goes h2, rook e1 check, king d5, rook f6, you give a check, you give another check. Obviously, the king cannot really stay on the a file, so you have to go king c1, you give a check. King d2 here is an actual blunder, because after knight b3 check, it turns out that, well, you're not going to like crossing over to this side of the board, because rook e1 and then king e5 wins some material, although white probably holds this position after something like rook h6. So if you don't want to blunder a rook, you go king d1, to which black replies by playing rook a4, playing quiet moves when you're full rook down, rook h6, and now what is even more fantastical, black goes king c4. Obviously, if you take on h2, check, check, picks this rook up. So white starts pushing his own passer, plays c6. Black plays king d3. All of this, as mentioned, I mean, none of this is realistic, but the line is so beautiful that I wanted to show it to you anyway. Rook h3 check f3. Now the only move that avoids getting mated by rook a1 is bishop f5 check, so it's not impossible to find. Knight f5, rook f3, we go king c4. Rook f5, there's obviously rook a1, rook takes e1, so white plays c7. And black goes knight d6. And this apparently holds for black. I'm showing you this because you know there is a certain beauty in chess in following what the absolute best line is, and there are some motifs in there. In particular, the idea of driving the king towards decent squares and then playing rook a4 and just activating your own king in a position where you full rook down. That has to appeal to any lover of studies and beauty in chess in general, but in practical terms, it's absolutely impossible to find. And after bishop g4, I think black would have been hard-pressed to make good moves. Instead of all this, Vladimir played bishop d3. This is still okay, but now black once again is doing quite well. Rook a4 check. And things started really going badly for Vladimir here when he played king b1. I really don't quite understand why he didn't play king b2 here. There are no discovered checks available, and the king from e5 needs to go to rather unpleasant squares to even create threats of discovered check. And after king e6, I suspect even something like rook h1 might be quite decent here. And white is not really going to win this game. The pawn on c5 will probably fall. But white will never ever, in the worst possible nightmares, will lose this position. Instead of this, Vladi played king b1, and here Fabiano seized his chance with both hands. He went knight b3, immediately creating some problems for white. Rook e1 check is correct. King d5, and in this position, once again, objectivity says that you can take on f6. Rook a1 check, you can play king b2, you can take on b3, and after h2 you can play bishop c4 check. And it turns out that there are no good squares. You cannot go to the e file because of rook e6 check, so you take on c5, rook f5 check. And once again, if you go forward, I can take on h4, on f4 and play rook h4, and this is an obvious draw. And if you go the other direction, white has bishop d5. And even this is not the end of the line. Black can play f3. You have to take with the bishop, I believe. Black goes rook e3 check, and rook takes f3. But this is still a draw because we're in time to play rook h5. And then we run with the king towards the g3 square, pick up on h2, and we end up with an absolutely empty board. But once again, by this point I think Vladimir was playing more or less on increment. And even getting to this position is very difficult, and trusting yourself on increment that you will not actually lose this is even hard. I don't think it's particularly realistic to expect this from anyone. So he played king c2 instead, knight d4 check. Yeah, and this is where the game went completely off the rails for him, because he failed to notice that he can actually play king c1 here. Once again, this is very, very important to have bishop b1 as an option against all the checks from a1. He went back to b1, and here knight f3. This is still objectively a draw, somewhat surprisingly, but in the situation Kramnik suddenly found himself in, very, very little time and actual problems to solve. He, as does happen in these cases, he made a jerky hand move without really engaging the brain very much, because you are afraid of losing on time, and you can see that the game went out of your control, but you can't really do very much about it at that point. And he played rook d1. You can still play rook takes f6 here, knight takes e1, and bishop f1. And this position is still okay for white somehow, because after h2 he has rook h6, and white does pick up the pawn on h2, and he shouldn't lose this position. White will have to... I mean, black is perfectly justified in trying for a bit, but objectively, because the rook and knight is so completely drawn, and the bishop already is controlling the promotion square, with the 15 minutes added at move 60, Vladimir would not have lost this position. But he needed to get to move 60, and this is move 59. And unsurprisingly, he did not go for rook f6, bishop f1. It really doesn't look very attractive unless you have enough time to check and convince yourself that this is a draw, and he went rook d1, which just loses on the spot. Rook takes a1, rook takes d1. We made move 60, and 15 minutes were added to Vladimir's clock, and he spent, I think maybe 10 out of those 15 minutes just coming to terms with what happened, because obviously he thought he can take on d1 here, but after h2, rook h6, and well, either knight h4, bishop h4, it doesn't really much matter which one you choose. This is just a queen. You cannot even give up a rook for this pawn. It queens with check, and the game is completely over. Resigning here would not have been out of place, but Vladimir spent some time sort of getting to grips with what happened in this game, because I'm sure he realized that at least at some point over the course of this game he was doing extremely well. Not originally. Like, the game underwent a lot of transformations, and originally it was equal, and then somewhere around here, obviously Fabiano was close to winning, if not just winning. But I'm sure Vladimir realized just how good his position was somewhere around here. He just couldn't find the way to convert this into a full point. So this explains why the game from this moment onwards continued for another 6 moves. I'll show you the conclusion of the game, but these moves really weren't very necessary. But somewhere around f2, Vladimir realized that, this is not really helping anybody, and resigned. A tremendously exciting game, which featured, I think, more plot twists than any recent game between players of anywhere near this strength that I can remember. Generally, you don't get such complete reversals of fortune more than once in a game, and here you can definitely say that both sides were winning at one point, and there were at least 3 complete turnarounds over the course of a 60-move game played in arguably the most important tournament of the year, if you don't count the World Championship match. So yeah, there's no way you can call this a perfect game of chess. There were too many mistakes for it, but it was fantastic to watch and commentate on live if you don't mind making horrible prediction mistakes more or less every half an hour. And I hope I did a reasonable job of recapping the main points. Sorry about the lost picture somewhere in between, somewhere in the middle. I don't know what I did to crash the client, but as people who have seen me operate heavy machinery know, this happens regularly for no reason whatsoever. I will end the video on this note. I hope you enjoyed it. This has been Peter Svidler recapping round 4 of the Berlin candidates for Chess 24.